Good afternoon, everyone. This is 𝗩𝗲𝗶𝗃, uh, Deputy Director of the Institute of Creative Writing. And for this afternoon session, we shall focus on Indonesian literature and writing. With me today are speakers Manneke Budiman, Arlo Mendoza, 𝗍𝗶𝘁, and Ariel Lopez. But before we proceed to their conversation, allow me to introduce the speakers first. Manneke Budiman teaches literature and cultural studies at the Department of Literature, Faculty of Humanities, Universitas in Indonesia. He received formal training in English literature, comparative literature, and Asian studies. His research interests include gender studies, youth culture, popular culture, contemporary Indonesian literature, and media studies. He currently teaches translation, literary criticism, critical theories, and cultural flows in Southeast Asia. Arlo Mendoza, our first reactor, is an assistant professor of Southeast Asian literature and creative writing at the Department of Filipino and Philippine Literature here in the University of Philippines in Budiman. His research interests include Indonesian and Vietnamese literature, cultural Cold War in Southeast Asia, and translation studies. His works have appeared in Southeast Asian Studies, Jonas Akda, the Asian Journal of Literature, Culture, and Performance, Asian Books Blog, Likhaan, and World Literature Today. He is the co-editor of Ulirat, Best Contemporary Stories in Translation from the Philippines, published by 𝗩𝗲𝗂𝗁 in 2021, and Destination SEA 2050 AD from Penguin Random House 2022. He has translated the works of 𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗃, 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗃, and 𝗦𝗍𝗶𝗋𝗃 into Filipino. He is also a member of the 𝗏𝗃s, a band of translators of contemporary Southeast Asian literature. Next to be introduced is Ariel Lopez. Ariel C. Lopez is a PhD and associate professor at the Asian Center, University of the Philippines in Diliman, where he teaches courses on Southeast Asia. He is trained as a historian at the University of the Philippines and Leiden University from the Netherlands. His dissertation dealt on the history of Islam and Christianity in North Sulawesi. He is interested in the colonial history of Indonesia and the Philippines. Last but not the least, we shall listen in to Dominic C., who teaches Southeast Asian literature at the University of the Philippines in Budiman. His collection of stories, A Natural History of Empire, won the Crítica Cultura from the Ateneo de Manila University Press Best First Book Prize and was also a finalist for the Madrigal Gonzalez Best First Book Award and the Philippine National Book Award. Before we proceed to the conversation, allow me to reiterate the rationale for the first Asian Forum on writing. This was originally proposed by Dr. Ramon Guillermo, and as soon as he proposed it to the body, we all agreed that it is about time that we as Filipinos listen to our Asian neighbors and mutually both sides would learn from one another as members of the larger imagined community that is Asia and the world. So a virtual round of applause for Professor Manneke Budiman, please. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It was great to meet you all. I also attended the morning session and I was very impressed with the quality of the session and the discussion and the speakers. And I would like to present a topic on contemporary Indonesian literature This is the big theme, and I will focus my presentation, my talk, on the return of orality in Indonesian literature nowadays, especially in light of the age of digital literacy that we are witnessing now. First of all, before I start, please let me thank with all my heart the kindness and the invitation that I received from my friends in UP, especially 𝗩𝗏𝗀. I'm honored and I thank you very much. I'm very happy to meet you all. So let me start my presentation then. All right, I will briefly go back to the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s. Why? Because for many scholars, this is the kind of the renaissance for modern Indonesian literature. And why is that? It's because despite the Cold War at that time, especially in Southeast Asia, and the very violent and fierce ideological polarization, okay, between the left and the right, okay, writers and artists, all across the archipelago, they continue and even with more enthusiasm, further explore different visions, different possibilities, opportunities, and futures for Indonesian culture. A culture that is considerably young at that time, after the independence, 5 years after the independence. And so right after independence, we immediately plunge into the ideological Cold War. But writers and artists, they actively engage in that ideological Cold War. Yet at the same time, they continue working together, okay, to look for visions, to look for the best configuration of what Indonesian literature or Indonesian culture in a larger scale should look like. Okay? And as usual, it's always a dilemmatic situation between the continuous pull of tradition and the urgent need to also be part of modernity. Okay? And it's between these two forces that artists and writers at that time open up their horizon, looking at what other people in other countries have been doing with their culture and literature. And what is interesting is that these young writers, mostly in their 20s or early 30s, they believe and they perceive Indonesian culture, okay, as heirs to world culture, the legitimate heirs of world culture. Okay. And so based on that, it was a manifesto, in fact. And so based on that, the writers then, they were experimenting with different local traditions, with what other artists and writers were doing in other countries, and then try to dig up the existing local traditions that probably many of which have been buried alive, ignored. Okay, and so they try to also dig up the local traditions again and try to create in a creative way a blending, okay, or different ways of blending, okay, the imported thoughts, ideas, culture, and models into the local existing models. Okay. So that is basically the activity in the 1950s and in the first half of the 1960s in Indonesian literature. But then suddenly these very vibrant activities had to abruptly ended because of the coup taking place in September the 30th, 1965, And ever since that time, everything changed. The thing would never be the same again for Indonesia and for Indonesian culture or literature. Okay? And then we saw a new page in Indonesian politics, okay, in which the new order then took over power and continued to rule the country for the next 32 years. And with their prejudice and hostility towards arts, towards culture, then it was no wonder to see heavy censorship and difficult situations that authors, artists had to endure throughout the New Order period in Indonesia. Now, and then suddenly in the 1997, which went all the way to the 1998, the Asian monetary crisis hit Indonesia and other Southeast Asian countries quite hard. And because of this crisis, then Indonesian people were able to see how corrupt and how shaky the foundation of the new order's 32 years rule and legitimacy. Okay? And their failure to deal with political crisis following the economic crisis. Okay? And this all culminated in May 1998 with riots, and some people said that there were mass rapes as well. But the event then resulted in the new order having to step down from power. So a new era was opened for Indonesian people, an era of freedom, of democratization, which we popularly call the Reformasi. And along with the Reformasi, there emerged new critical voices by new generation of writers that we have never heard before, that we have never read before, but then suddenly in a large number, they turn up, they become part of the Indonesian literary society. And as a result, we had an explosion of literary production in the aftermath of the Reformasi. So say between the first 5 years all the way to the end of the first decade of the Reformasi. Many literary critics argued that with this Reformasi, then Indonesia again saw another renaissance after more than 32 years having to endure the repressive rule of the new order. Okay? And there are many new and distinctive aspects in literature that we have never seen before now are visible and occur in many of the literary works produced in the Reformasi. Okay. And so something is changing, something is happening with the aesthetics. Okay, yeah, and here are some of the new trends that I think stand out as the characteristics of Indonesian literature after the Reformasi. Okay. So the first one is among writers, there seems to be skepticism, okay, a common sense of skepticism, okay, toward the nation, any notion of national, okay, such as in national literature, national culture, national identity. And all of these were perceived to be the legacy of the new order. Okay, anything national was perceived to be the legacy of the new order. So in order to respond to that, then these young writers and artists as well, they shift the paradigm and their outlook from something that is domestic, national, Indonesian, into a more global outlook, okay, toward cosmopolitanism. Okay. They were really enchanted and fascinated by imaginative adventures beyond the official borders of the nation state of Indonesia, going to other places, other countries, which we can see in the many works that they produce at that time. Okay. And at the same time, there is also an opposite trend taking place. It's not something that is outward or cosmopolitan, but more an inward look. Okay, yeah. So along with this strive to break free from any national constraint by going beyond the national border, yeah, of culture as well as of the nation state, some artists and writers also seem to have a renewed interest in revisiting local tradition and local colors, the indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom, which during the New Order period was also suppressed, because the priority of the New Order government at that time is to forge and to impose a national unity across the archipelago. So these two trends then become the new characteristic of Indonesian literature in the aftermath of the Reformasi. And then we see literary works being read by audience, existing works written by the old masters such as Pramudia Anantatur and Father Mangunwijaya, a Jesuit writer. And then at the same time, new writers such as Nukila Amal or Ayu Utami, Linda Cristanti, they also appear, and they actually are put in the equal footing, okay, with the old masters. Okay, so they didn't really live under the shadow or within the shadow of their seniors, but they create a position for themselves among them. And here it is, writers began to write stories whose settings are actually abroad, outside Indonesia, yeah, and stories about the characters who travel, who go far away from Indonesia, visiting other places and other countries, meeting cultures and peoples that they have never heard before or they have never visited before, without any fear, yeah, of being lost or being a stranger among strangers. Okay? And also at the same time with the courage to redefine their own Indonesianness within this new global and national nexus. Okay? And so they also feel confident in themselves and quite comfortable to be anywhere outside Indonesia. Okay? Joining in conversations in foreign languages with people that they have met in their adventure, in their journey, in the stories, and also participating in many unfamiliar cultural practices in those places, being part of other cultures and other people as if they are not visitors or strangers. And so that's one thing. And at the same time, critical exploration also began to construct a different type of Indonesianness that was actually created by the New Order at the expense of many existing traditions. So there's this project among writers to revisit those traditions in order to do away with the New Order selective multiculturalism and to be able to imagine a new Indonesia or a new Indonesianness. So this renewed interest in tradition and local knowledges was a very important project, okay? Because it's like an encounter with, as if it's an encounter with something foreign, with something unfamiliar, okay, for these new young writers who most part of their life was actually concentrated in Jakarta or on Java. Okay. Although they have different ethnic backgrounds, but most of them grew up in Jakarta and they started their career as writers in Jakarta. So even talking about their own hometowns in faraway islands in the eastern part of Indonesia or in the western part of Indonesia seems like a very exciting new adventure, as if you were visiting a foreign country and meeting people there for the first time. So this phenomenon then appeared more and more frequently in many more works. Okay? It becomes a recurring feature of Indonesian contemporary literature. And now I can safely assume that locality has become a dominant aspect or dimension, in addition to the more cosmopolitan feature which I touched earlier. So there are more voices coming from the margin, from the faraway places in the archipelago. Okay, from Aceh, people wrote stories with the background of the separatist conflict happening before the tsunami, or what happened after the tsunami with the Acehese people as background, and they create characters and stories. Yeah. Also, stories coming from Bali, works written by Balinese writers, containing critical responses toward the existing Hindu Balinese adat or customary practice. And then also in Lombok, there is work telling the story of the religious persecution of the Ahmadi Muslim minority by the Muslim majority group. Okay. And then at the same time in Lombok, we also see a very critical view of the existing tradition or adat coming from the Islamic perspective, which is a more modern, or claim to be a more modern outlook in comparison to the tradition. From Maluku, stories set with the background of the interreligious conflict between the Muslim and the Christians, and Papua, exploitation of the natural resources, militarism, and also environmental destruction by multinational corporations operating in Papua. Yeah. But in addition to all those stories about the outer islands, we also have stories written in new perspective about the rural areas in Java, which again were actually hardly touched by writers who wrote during the New Order period. Okay. And also this old age competition between the Muhammadiyah school of thought and the Nahdlatul school of thought within the Islamic communities that also attracted writers to write about. Okay. And many other types of voices coming from the margin. So there's this new emerging literary movement, which specifically looks inward to what is left behind, what is missing, what is forgotten, and yet at the same time offering rich, complex, irresistible attraction. And all these before, during the New Order era, were actually ignored or marginalized. And so there is this sense of incompleteness, there is this sense of lack and restlessness among the present-day writers because of this something that is missing, which should have been part of their Indonesianness as well. Okay. So they then in this effort to represent the locals, they tend to resort to realism. To portray the locals in their everyday reality, using vernacular languages, vernacular expressions, vocabulary of the local languages or dialects. And the setting also take place in the traditional natural setting of the villages or of the communities in those islands or in those remote places. Okay. And to me, then this could be read as an attempt to establish a distinction from not only Java and the capital city of Jakarta, but also distancing away from a centralized notion of Indonesia or Indonesianness that was solidified during the New Order era. So we have Tarian Bumi of Karusmini from Bali, Tanah Tabu, written by young author Anindita Taif, and then also Arafat Nur, an award-winning writer producing very productive, very prolific, and one of the most recent novel by him is Lolong Anjing Bulan, set in the background of separatist conflict at that time before the peace agreement. And here is the focus of my talk, which is the return of orality. So in all those processes which I have just described, this is a significant presence of orality, of oral dimension in the dialogues among the characters in those works, which take the form of the use of local vocabulary, elliptic sentences, incomplete utterances. It's like a very conversational tone and atmosphere, with local jokes, local anecdotes, local metaphors and proverbs. And then sometimes dialogues are interrupted by laughter, which you can really see in the works. As if the readers, as if we were sitting together with the characters and listening to the storyteller or the narrator narrating the story. And you can ignore the narrator. Sometimes you want to go back to listen to the narrator because of all the interruptions. So it's an atmosphere of orality that is quite predominant there. And this, for me, is kind of a manifestation of resistance to the formalized use of the national language, the Indonesian language, which, according to writers such as Afrisa Malna or Pramudia Anantatur, has robbed people's ability to speak, themselves, okay? And which denied them their self-articulation, because now they are not encouraged to use their local languages in their communication, but they have to learn Bahasa Indonesia as the second language. Okay? Yeah. So especially during the New Order period, the Indonesian language was systematically and structurally imposed by the state in order to be a state language. And as a result, most of Indonesian literary works produced during the New Order and even after have been heavily written in the standard formal Indonesian language. And so we see then effort to resist the national among these writers. There are works that are more cosmopolitan oriented, which is also another manifestation of resistance to the national language, because in this work you will be able to see characters speaking in different languages, people speaking English, Arabic, Thai, Burmese, Spanish, sometimes mixed together in a conversation among characters coming from different nationality and different background meeting in the story. And you also can see a linguistic phenomenon of code switching or code mixing, mixing Indonesian, switching from Indonesia to another language, mixing it with another language, which as a whole then serve to undermine the primacy of the Indonesian language as the national language. And so as a result, the rigid normative boundaries of the national language, which was untouchable during the New Order period, now is breached, is transgressed, both inwardly by the use of local languages and outwardly by the heavy presence of foreign languages in the conversation and dialogues in many of those works. Also return is the cosmopolitan dream of the writers from the 1950s. Then they relive this dream to be heir of the world culture, okay, by contributing to the world culture by absorbing them and then blending them with the local elements and local richness. And once the blending is done, then these writers then claim or appropriate the final result to be their own, to be Indonesian, okay? And at the same time, global or world. Okay? So for such an aesthetic endeavor, then writers carry out their exploration, okay? In order to come up with alternative meaning, with alternative vision of Indonesianness that is different from the one promoted by the new order. And this return of orality is intriguing to me because it occurs exactly at the time when communication technology and digital technology provide more space and possibilities for writers and artists to experiment with new forms and looks that are made possible by technology. So and at the same time, you have this pullback toward orality. So some authors began to exploit these technologies to produce works that can be called digital literature, which include visual forms, color, digital shapes, and you can see them on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, multimedia novels on YouTube, but also fan fiction with tens of websites of fan fiction that are now available for free viewing. And so, here I come to my closing slide. So the rise of digital literacy also brings orality back into literature. In fact, helping to make it possible, to make orality possible to be brought back into literature, okay, rather than canceling each other. Okay. So as a result, we have a narrower gap between orality and literacy, not a gap that gets wider and wider because of technology, but a gap that is made more narrow between the two. Okay. Against the logic that the more sophistication we have with literacy, then the more we see the possibility for orality to disappear from written works, from literary works. Okay? And that is not the case here. So the present day Indonesia also witnesses the emergence of different or diverse trends. And we almost cannot even hardly make any categorization anymore like in the past. We have Islamic literature, sastra Islam, fan fiction, digital-based fiction, sastra maritime literature, urban literature, cyber literature, and many other labels. Okay? And as you can see in those labels and categories, there are overlaps between genre and movement. Okay? So it's a genre and at the same time it's a movement. Okay. Such as in sastra maritim or maritime literature or sastra Islam, you see a new kind of genre is appearing, but it also a kind of movement among the writers practicing that type of literature. And so it is becoming more and more difficult nowadays to distinguish the two. Okay. And this is also the result of technological intervention, which also influences and shapes genre because of the features that are provided by the technological platforms, which authors can freely choose to use. So I will stop there, and thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to the discussion and also listening to what the reactors have to say about Indonesian contemporary literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Manneke, for your insightful reflections on the contemporary Indonesian literary scene. I'll keep my reaction short and sweet. Treat my notes and some of my comments as a way to set the table for our discussion, roundtable discussion later. So here it goes. I'll read through some of my notes.
Thank you.
Like most foreign readers, My first introduction to Indonesian literature was through the works of Khairil Anwar and other members of the famed Angkatan 45. So that includes Astrul Sani, Sitor Situmorang, and others. There's also Pramudia Anantatur's Buru Quartet and several works of the Angkatan 66 generation. So this includes writers like Gunawan Muhammad, Rendra, among many others. And as Professor Budiman pointed out in his lecture, these are writers and literary sensibilities that are easy to fit in a specific national narrative. In the case of Angkatan 45, they were seen as the prophets of Indonesian revolution. In the case of Pramudia Anantatur, many critics and writers see him as the quintessential post-colonial novelist, especially with his Buru Quartet, although we know that he has more works and he's more than the quartet. For the Angkatan 66, some of its members and some critics note that this generation signaled the end of political commitment as a constitutive part of literary activity, at least in Indonesia. So these are the first works I read as a foreign reader of Indonesian literature, and as a, I would say, pretty well-versed reader of, or at least pretty well-versed reader of Philippine literature, familiar with my own national literary history, I can see all the convergences. I see the similarities, and that's what got me interested in Indonesian literature in the first place. These initial convergences and similarities. However, when I started learning the language and I started reading other writers, I stumbled upon the works of writers like Seno Gomira Ajidarma, Wiji Tukul, Ayu Utami, and of course, he's very popular now in the Philippines, Eka Kurniawan. And personally, when I encountered their works, I felt that they were some of the few writers that clearly broke away from the mold of Indonesian literature that tries to peddle a specific national narrative. Or they are perhaps literary works that try to address the specters, the hauntings, and the ghosts of previous historical events in the nation. So for instance, you see in Ayutami and Eka Kurniawan, of course, though a different handling of Namlima, and for Seno Gumira Ajidarma, when I read Just Parfumdan incident, it was really a revelation because it was one of the first few exposés on the Dili massacre or the Santa Cruz massacre happening in Timor-Leste. So, and of course, in the case of Vijay Tukul, it's very interesting because a lot of people signed on the death knell of committed literature in Indonesia, but during the 80s and the 90s, he was part and parcel. He was part of a movement, and was also writing poetry about the experiences of the oppressed, the workers, the peasants. So, I think as a foreign reader, they were the first writers who showed me a different side of Indonesian literature. Of course, there are more writers, as mentioned in the presentation. But as a foreign reader, it was really a revelation for me when I encountered their works. But I think aside from the points mentioned by Pa Budiman in his lecture, there are two more factors that push Indonesian literature to the direction where it is right now. And I think and it is small presses or penerbit kecil and translation, regional and international. So small independent publishers like Margin Kiri, Ultimus, Komunitas Bambu, Insis Press, Kendi, Buku Mojok, Muy Pustaka, among many others, has given Indonesian writers who are in the peripheries or refuse to engage with national literary establishment to be published and be heard. Personally, I discovered writers such as Dea Anugrah, Eko Triono, Intan Paramadita, Rati Kumala, Sabda Armando, 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗻𝗓 Situmorang, among many others, through these small presses. These publishers not only contributed to the growth and diversity of contemporary Indonesian literature, but also made strides in other fields such as history, politics, cultural studies, and translation. So I fondly remember buying books that published, for instance, the papers for the 45th anniversary of the Communist Party of Indonesia, and it was published by Ultimus. I wouldn't imagine any university press or Gramedia to be publishing books such as that. So it was interesting for me that certain dynamic between small presses or independent publishers and mainstream publishers and university publishers in Indonesia, because in the Philippines it's kind of similar, but that's a discussion for later. So yeah, so this brings me to my second point, translation. So while Max Lane, Harry Eveling, and John McLean's efforts were instrumental in introducing Indonesian literature to a wider audience in the 20th century and early 21st century, what with publications like Menagerie and imprints like Lontar. It is also translation, interestingly, and a new generation of translators that has been responsible in introducing a new crop of Indonesian writers to a foreign audience. For instance, through the efforts of Annie Tucker and Stephen Epstein, the novels of 𝗩𝗁𝗀𝗃 and 𝗍𝗏𝘗𝗀 gained global readership. So I remember reading 𝗍𝗏𝗃 when I just gained my Lanjut 2 certification for Bahasa Indonesia, and I was able to read through it. I was able to breeze through it, but of course, after I read Stephen Epstein's translation of 𝗍𝗏𝗃 or The Wandering, I saw a lot of possible. I understood it a bit more, because back then I was just a fledgling and an aspiring translator of Indonesian literature. But just to plug the novel, it is really an interesting novel. It was kind of modeled after Julio Cortázar's Hopscotch, where there's no linear narrative and you're under the whim of the writer. But yeah, anyway, so through the efforts of Annie Tucker and Stephen Epstein, 𝗩𝗁𝗀𝗃 and 𝗍𝗏𝘗𝗃 gained global leadership. Lara Norgard and Tiffany Chow's efforts, which won them Penheim translation grants, ushered in the entry of Sabda Armandio and Norman Erickson 𝗏𝗏𝗃 to the world literary scene. So, and I think 𝗍𝗏𝗀 Barroca, an Indonesian poet and translator, her efforts as currently editor at large for modern poetry and translation, must also be recognized, because when I last spoke to her 2 weeks ago, she was actually planning to edit an issue which features not only Indonesian and Filipino writers but Southeast Asian writers. So her efforts not only in popularizing Indonesian literature and Philippine literature must also be recognized, but because she also extends her vision for the whole region. Yeah. So I guess and of course there are also publishers like Two Lines, Deep Vellum, and Tilted Axis that favor writing or translations from Southeast Asia. So for instance, Tilted Axis has a very interesting roster of Indonesian writers. I think Norman Erickson 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏's poetry collection was published by Tilted Axis. So it's very interesting because compared to, for instance, the 20th century, where most of the translators are foreigner, we see an influx of translators from Southeast Asia. For instance, Tiffany Chow is half Indonesian, half Singaporean, if I'm not mistaken. And we see an influx of translators from the region or from Indonesia translating works from Indonesia for foreign readers or for a global audience. I guess to end, since I want Tom and Professor Lopez to have more time for their notes and comments. To end, I want to register my agreement with Professor Budiman's assessment on the difficulty of putting a label on the current trends and directions in Indonesian literature. I think it was a debate. I think before, after Sastra Reformasi and Sastra Pasca Reformasi, there's also this attempt to label it as angkatan contemporary, and it, of course, it did not fly. But yeah, I guess for literature clearly refusing to churn out Jamesonian national allegories, The clear recourse is, of course, to gesture towards the new configurations, experimentation, cosmopolitanism, and an antipodal return to tradition as a way to interrupt and disrupt the crystallized narratives and shibboleths of the old. So I end my reaction here. Thank you again, Manneke, for your very insightful lecture.
Thank you very much, Arlo.
Good afternoon. Salamat siyang pa. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Nondika and the UP Institute for Creative Writing for organizing this very important forum. I've already learned so much from your lecture and also from Professor Arlo's comments. But first, I'm not a person in the literary field. In studying literature, I'm a historian. But some concepts really caught my attention. The increasing importance of locality, orality, rise of vernacular during this unique period in Indonesian literary history after the New Order, post-Reformasi period. We have this sort of literary flourishing, as you have seen in 1950s Indonesia. But having said that, I have a couple of questions, and hopefully this could start a conversation. You don't have to answer all of this, but first, I think I see somewhat of a contrast, perhaps a contradiction between what you see, the rising importance of locality, but also the cosmopolitan, the global outlook, as you call it, of these writers. And I would like to know more about how writers, perhaps you have examples of how writers sort of navigate these two contradicting theme, of important, seemingly contradictory theme of locality and global outlook. And that is also my observation on the rise of, say, Sastra Islam, which I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, would be more universalist in theme, cosmopolitan, and how does locality figure into that? Yeah. And the second question, I think, is about audience. Yeah. If you look at if you sort of disaggregate the demographics, say which genre would be more popular to a particular age group or gender, yeah, or perhaps even class, or geographic location, rural, urban. Because you've already mentioned, there's a rise of literary production in Aceh, in eastern Indonesia, perhaps also in 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, in different parts of Java. But I would like to know more about the gender part, yeah, or age. Yeah, I would imagine more young people would consume the digital those which have a digital component than the older ones. Yeah. And also class, perhaps, or even ethnicity. Yeah. Okay, that's the second comment. The third is already mentioned by Professor Arlo Mendoza, is about circulation of these literary works. But I would like to add, I mean, how do big popular bookstores like, say, Gramedia or Periplus sort of influence which books are being circulated and which writers are read? Do they, do they prefer? Do they, or for instance, regional bookstores or regional presses in outer islands, so in outside Java? Is there government subsidy for these small presses, or for can they get, for instance, individual authors support from such cultural institutions as maybe the Balay Pelastarian, or these kinds of funding cultural bodies. And fifth, or third, or I think I think fourth or fifth, but as a historian, I hear from colleagues that I mean it's still hard to write on difficult periods of Indonesian history. Always have that military government hanging at the background. But I guess this is the power of literature, that it could, because of course the sources for talking about history and historical sources, many of the historical sources are either destroyed or still gate kept in various institutions, and literature is not subject to that rules. Historical fiction, fiction, or specifically historical fiction. So I think this is important, but also I would like to know, I've heard from colleagues doing history that there's a few hundred history departments in Indonesia, but we only get to listen or read works from those from big universities, the UI, UGM. But I wonder whether, if you look at universities teaching literature in Indonesia, do they teach this new emerging literature that you've mentioned, several of them? And what kind of literature is being taught and read in not only in those big cosmopolitan universities, but even in very far away universities, and even teachers' colleges. Okay. Second to the final point. Well, this morning I attended a thesis defense on soft power, and I'm tempted to say that Indonesia has this emerging, right. Indonesia has been part of that Frankfurt book fair, and I think that's amazing. But where do you see this rise of Indonesian literary production going? If you, of course, most of the historical production in Indonesia is produced fortunately by I think even by the wider academic scene, by Western universities, white academics. But I think it is high time really to really project this cultural achievements of individual Indonesian authors, and maybe you can tell us how. I would like more Southeast Asians to consume this kind of works. Maybe recommendations, thoughts on how do we move forward in promoting Indonesian literature. And final comment. Recent, a few days ago, we have this news of the criminal code, of Indonesia being revised. Are we seeing a trend towards general more social conservatism in Indonesia? And do you think this would reflect in the literary production, or is it already reflecting in the kind of works that's being produced? I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, hello. Sorry, can't be heard. Okay, so first I just want to say, yeah, thank you, Pak Manneke. Makasih banyak. The lecture was really, it was very insightful. It's definitely something that I was already thinking about. Oh, I should take some of these insights to my students at the moment, because I am teaching sastra, Southeast Asia at the moment, and of course Indonesia is part of that. I really only have about 3 main questions, and I think I'll organize my reaction just around those questions. The first of those is very very theoretical, very abstract. I was struck by the talking about orality, of course, right, and the idea of orality. And just as a very abstract question, I was wondering, I know that orality, or a lot of the discussion, our frameworks for understanding orality, they're highly influenced by Walter Ong. And Walter Ong himself makes a differentiation between, I think it was called primary orality and secondary orality. And basically, secondary orality is the orality in a culture that is already literate. And I was wondering, just in terms of describing this new kind of orality that's emerging in the internet and of course in literature, to what extent is that different from previous kinds of orality? Like what does it mean? What are the characteristics of this new kind of orality? Because orality isn't necessarily the same, and the other components of the culture, literate components of culture, right, will change the dimensions of that orality. So that was the first thing I thought of. It was just a very theoretical, abstract question, just as an immediate response to the main topic. The other questions are a little more, it might need a little more introduction for me to explain where I'm coming from. So the first one is actually, about this idea of diversity. And the question is, or what I was thinking is, whether there are kind of these more structural or larger, I'm not sure if this is the best way to phrase it, but kind of like constraints to this diversity that may not be immediately obvious. And where I'm coming from, to explain what that means, I'm coming from a place of basically, before I was teaching Southeast Asian literature, before I got into Indonesian literature, my specialization actually was Philippine literature, specifically Philippine literature in English, because that's a separate tradition of Philippine literature. It's a complicated topic. There's no need to get into that. So I have some background in that, and I also did some work in, for example, we have something called the Cultural Center in the Philippines, Encyclopedia of Philippine Art, basically. So I did some work on that as well. And in the process of doing some of that work, I read a lot about various critics in the Philippines and how they tried to periodize Philippine literature as well. And what I found it very funny, once I got into Indonesian literature and I was reading, similar works about the Baris Angkatans and stuff like that, that once you get past the dictatorial period, whether it's martial law in the Philippines or Orde Baru in Indonesia, it's described exactly in the same way. It's very diverse. It's kind of funny. You kind of also sometimes get a sense that the critics gave up in trying to characterize it, because basically it's, so we had the period of dictatorship, and in this period there was a lot of constraints on literature, and there was a lot of tension, and there were those who kind of not necessarily collaborated with the government, but definitely stayed silent or definitely kept to themselves. And then there were those who fought regardless. And so there's a very clear narrative. And then once the dictatorial period is over, it's very much, and there was an explosion of genres, styles, and all of these different forms. And I know that the explanations are often very similar. So one of them, of course, is, I think the most obvious one is a loosening of political control, right? And so there's more freedom to publish, more freedom to write, more people therefore are writing in different ways. And of course, in a sense, depending on which community you're looking at, the big bad enemy has kind of disappeared. So there's a little more fragmentation in terms of what people are interested in. Other issues, of course, or other things that were brought up, though, and this was brought up as well in your talk, was issues like globalization. So we're entering into a period of globalization. And in theory, at least, that means that there's more, this might be a very technical way of putting it, but there's more, let's say, cultural inputs from different places in the world. And so those influences are having, their own forms of influence, right? And then, of course, there's the internet, the digital age, which is kind of even more exaggerated version of that. And as a result, yes, explosion of genres, many different styles, combination of media, forms of media, an emergence, for example, of many writings from minority groups, groups that were ignored previously. That also happens here, especially after martial law. Regional, the emphasis on the regions, moving away from especially Manila, right? And Manila and Jakarta are very similar as cities in the sense of when I went to Jakarta once, I was struck by how horribly similar it was, and I wanted to get away as soon as possible. It's the same problem. It's a Jakarta centrism, a Manila centrism, and there's a movement to try to get away from that. And so an explosion of regional literature. In the Philippines, workshops are a big deal, at least as far as literary institutions are concerned. And there's an explosion of workshops amongst different provinces and regions. So those are all very similar, a very similar pattern of emerging diversity. But in the case of, well, let's say Philippine Lit in English, again, that kind of weird specific tradition we have, right? In the case of Philippine literature in English, there's also, at least I noticed, a very clear, I guess constraint isn't necessarily the right word, but it's a kind of a limited pattern whereby there's a lot of change and experimentation, but this change and experimentation is it's clear where the influences come from most. And that influence is very America-centric. So in America, they're reading Latin American literature, and 10 years later, Filipinos are reading Latin American literature, and they're starting to write a little bit like it. In America, suddenly they're reading 𝗩𝗁𝗏𝗏. And then 10 years later, 10 years after he's published in English more or less, Filipinos are starting to read 𝗩𝗁𝗏𝗏. So there's this very clear kind of, it's a bottleneck, passes through North America and it comes to us. And that's true even when it comes to experimentation of genre. So about 10 to 15 years ago, there was a lot of talk about, oh, we're right, the first Filipino crime novel, for example, in English, or first Filipino novel in English that is a crime written, for example, and stuff like that. The emergence of, Filipino science fiction, Filipino speculative fiction was a big term that was being bandied around. And of course, these things were very, it's always hybridized. It's never completely like copied or anything. But it's very clear that the terms of the genres and a lot of the times the influences were still very, not completely America-centric, but definitely it was passing through the literary institutions of New York, for example, or maybe London, sometimes Paris, things like that. And to me, that's a very obvious kind of constraint. It's globalization, but globalization itself, as we know, has its centers. And I was wondering to what extent this contemporary Indonesian literature that's very diverse, to what extent it also reflects that. Because it reflects those kinds of constraints. And some of to add just a little bit of context for my wondering about this, I noticed you mentioned earlier, right, that in contemporary Indonesian literature, there is now it's kind of like they're recovering the promise of the 1950s. And the word you mentioned was something like the heirs to be the Indonesian culture as the heirs of the world, which I know is from the surat 𝗩𝗁𝗏𝗏, right, which is the kami adalah ahli waris yang sah dari kebudayaan dunia, right? So we're the true heirs of the world, or we're like, appropriate heirs of world culture. But in the 1950s and 60s, I know things are different. I mean, in the sense, not just that Indonesia and the Philippines, of course, was kind of being constructed as a national construct, but in a way, the world itself was also in debate. Like, what does it mean to have for the world to exist? And of course, that's in the context of the Cold War. And so I remember in Jogja, when I was in Jakarta, exactly, when I went to Jakarta and felt that horrible sense that, I'm back in Manila. I spent a lot of time in the National Library, and I was going through Bintang Timur. I was going through the cultural pages of Bintang Timur, which is a popular daily back in the 1950s and 60s. And in the early 60s, Bintang Timur was edited by Pramudia 𝗩𝗏𝗏𝗏. And I was struck by how when I was going through the cultural pages, there was this very clear effort in those pages that was edited by Pramudia to promote writers from Africa, to promote writers from Asia. Obviously, this is partly a result of the Bandung Conference, the African Asian Writers Conference, and all of these pushes for like a third world movement. But I think also very clearly it was also influenced by, in the context of the Cold War, right? We have a world that is very much dominated by North America and Western Europe. But we have other possible centers that existed then. You had Moscow, you had
Beijing.
Well, in the case of Pramudia, I think he had a bit of like Beijing in his mind was a possible center as well. And so he was actively trying to promote writers from these other places, as compared to everything following, let's say, one bottleneck in North America, for example, or Western Europe, Frankfurt Book Fair, perhaps. So I was thinking that's what I was wondering. I was wondering if in terms of this diversity, if you nevertheless see certain kinds of patterns of constraint. That doesn't necessarily demean the diversity that exists, right? But definitely it is perhaps a pattern we can pay attention to, and maybe if we want to expand the diversity even further, right? If we really believe in the promise of diversity, that is something we can consciously work to fix, perhaps. So that was the second question. So about like the possible constraints behind the diversity. And my last question is actually, this is a little more off topic and a little more perhaps speculative is not the right word, but maybe I'm just very curious actually. And this is related to something that Ariel kind of brought up already when it came to, for example, he was talking about a rise in conservatism recently. Well, as we were mentioning, right, both in the Philippines and Indonesia, we have that very similar history of there was a period of dictatorship. Well, of course, there's the Cold War, one of the reasons why this period existed, right? And then the dictatorship, supposedly it ended, and then suddenly there was opening up, and suddenly there's freedoms, etc. But I know that both in the Philippines and Indonesia, there's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 years about the ways in which perhaps one way to put it is the ways in which dictatorship has returned or is returning or is on the verge of possibly returning, right? I think it's a little more clear in the Philippines given recent election results, but in general, that's the question, right? There's this sense of this kind of return almost to that older period, a return to martial law or a return to some elements of what you found in martial law. And of course, in Indonesia, 3 years ago, there was the 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗹, right? And I was remembering also, again, so when I was in Jogja, finally away from Jakarta, right? And I was passing through Jogja and I was going through these various bookstores, mostly the indie bookstores there. And I was looking for writers who were banned during the Orde Baru. This was around 2018, 2019. And I remember one instance where I was asking for some of these writers, and the owner, he told me, "Oh yeah, we have a copy of that." And then he kind of gestured for me to like, oh, come closer. And then he started whispering and he said, "Be careful who you ask about those authors. Right? Be careful where you go and mention the names of those authors, right? Don't say it out too loud." And I was like, what's going on? And he was talking about how basically very recently they had experienced a couple of raids in some of these stores and some of these things being confiscated. And I know actually exactly in around 2018, 2019, that was it hit Indonesian news, right? There were stores in Kediri, there were stores in Padang, there were stores in various places where books were being confiscated. And the Philippines is experiencing very much the same thing. Over the last few years, a lot of libraries, for example, have been pressured by the government. State libraries of universities and state colleges pressured to remove supposedly subversive books, right? Books, and many of those books are actually books, for example, that talk about martial law. And just recently, a few months ago, I believe it was last year. A few months ago, there was the Commission for the Filipino Language was kind of instructed by the government to stop publishing some of its books that dealt with martial law era, right? So there's this crackdown that is starting to happen. Once again, it's on the rise. Will it continue? Who knows? But how much we'll be able to fight it, right? That's not always the question. But my real question there is, given that context, I think to what extent, when we look at this diversity, should we link to precisely that expansion of freedom? Is there a sense that might be ending soon, or is there a sense that this is not ending perhaps, but it's being threatened? And how are people responding to it? Like basically what Ariel said, how are people responding to this kind of rise of, let's say, conservatism, rise of, let's say, a return to certain Orde Baru policies, for example? So those were just my questions, because I was very interested in the talk, and I wanted to kind of connect it with basically the experiences that we share, because as Arlo said, one of the reasons why I think a lot of us get into Indonesia in the Philippines is because we look at Indonesian history and literature and we think, wow, it's like us, but not. So yeah, that's it. That's all I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak, Pak Manneke. That
Thank
was a
you.
wonderful lecture. That was a very wonderful lecture. Everyone listening, I think, learned a lot. And also, we had very, very wonderful reactors. I told you, Pak Manneke, we're doing our job here in the Philippines, right?
Yes. I'm impressed,
Right, so-
Bowman.
So maybe we can start with trying to get some of your replies to some of the questions. I know there are so many questions. Many of them are so difficult to answer.
Yeah.
But we would be very happy if you could enlighten us on some of these questions that they've asked. Right? Maybe you can start with anyone and just try to answer the questions which are most easy to answer perhaps for you, and then
Sure.
leave some for the next time.
Yeah. So I will just do it chronologically, starting with Arlo, and then Ariel, and then Dominic, regardless which one is easy and which one is difficult. But promise me if I can answer all these questions, UP will give me my second PhD degree. Because they are all tough questions. All right, so these questions range from the ecosystem of literature, and then the historical, social, and political context, and or even all the way to more global context, which is really exciting because the three reactors to expand the topic from a very narrow talk about Indonesian contemporary literature into a larger context. Yes, that is challenging, but at the same time, I'm quite enthusiastic in responding or addressing this question. Arlo, are you also aware that there is North American small publishing called Dalang Publishing, based in San Mateo, California, also doing a very good job in introducing Indonesian writers. Many of them are even young and relatively unknown authors into the international readership. Okay? And so in addition to Lontar Foundation, and also now Kompas Gramedia do their own translation project for literary works. But yeah, the ecosystem, let me start with a complaint. Okay, yeah. Why is it, Southeast Asian literature in general, but Indonesian literature, is so hard to really make it into the international readership through translation, through international publishing? If you compare it with Indian literature, for instance, or African literature, that could easily get into Penguin, into Heinemann, into so many big international publishing. Yet Southeast Asian literature, Indonesian literature, no, everywhere you go, people only know Pramudia Anantatur for so many years, and now Eka Kurniawan, because of his book was also introduced and promoted in Frankfurt Book Fair. How should I say? Now, for many Indonesian writers, okay, I can be wrong, okay, but this is the impression I get from my many conversations with them. Okay. Their main concern is actually how to get national readership. That is already a challenge. To be read, to be known by 270 million people of Indonesia, that itself is a mission impossible, let alone talking about, being part of the international market of literature. And with many writers writing about specific local colors, then the work of translation even become more challenging, because there are concept terms that you cannot even find the equivalence in any other language, even in Indonesian language. Okay? And any translator who would want to take up the challenge really would have a hard time in doing so, especially the next step when they have to deal with the international publisher based outside Indonesia, in North America and Europe. So in terms of that, the future for translation of Indonesian literature, if the trend now continues, will even be uncertain. Yet, that doesn't prevent writers to continue writing about the locals, to continue inserting and introducing more local terms and concepts into Indonesian language. And if translated, we don't know. God knows how it's going to be done. But the grim and dark prospect of being internationally known, that doesn't stop Indonesian writers to continue with the vision that they think is best. Okay? If they now is trying to revisit traditions and the local knowledge, local wisdom, and so on, I don't think that will be hindered by the prospect of not being translated or not being published by international publishers such as Penguin, for instance. Okay. And then when we talk about the breakup from the old mainstream literature into new phenomenon, you mentioned Seno, Wicituku, Layu Utami, Eka. Most of these writers are relatively junior in comparison to Pramudia, Gunawan, or Mangunwijaya. Yeah. And Seno and Ayu, at least they were journalists before they became literary authors. Yeah. Wiji, yes, a literary author, but not in the same sense, in the same way we understand as author, with like in Salihara community, for instance, these are authors who are on the street, who don't have any community basis. They're everywhere and they mingle with every kinds of walks of life, and not the typical literary author. Except Eka, especially after he was introduced to the international readership, and I think there is also this, like as I said, skepticism with whatever is left by the new order, including the way we look at history, including how history is constructed. And that is why in many writers of the post-Reformasi generation, they don't talk about history at all, almost ahistorical. If you look at Ayu Utami, the earlier works, Saman, Larung, not the after that, ahistorical. So many of them didn't want to talk about the past at all. Mangunwijaya, Pramudia, they talk about the past, but it's a long past. For Mangunwijaya went back to the Majapahit era, all this ancient glory and kingdom. And then Pram, even though he talk about the past, he hides it behind the colonial past, while actually he is talking about the new order past. Okay, yeah. So a hesitant attitude to talk about history at all, even. And that is why Ayu Utami's generation, they look more toward what is beyond Indonesia. Contemporary, current, but not in Indonesia. Because if you have to confine yourself in the Indonesian context again, then you will be forced to talk about history again. Okay. But there is, of course, 10 years after Reformasi, a kind of temporary trend in which suddenly writers who were not interested in history, were not interested in 65, suddenly there's like a concerted effort of everybody talking about 65. Not all with equal success, of course, And then it's gone. Suddenly now people don't talk about it anymore, Yeah, whether it's saturated or whether they have new interests, but we don't know. We don't know. The urge to follow a trend that is temporary is also there. Yeah, but that doesn't really divert writers from their main vision. If they go cosmopolitan, then we will still see a very strong flavor of cosmopolitanism. If they go back to a tradition, then you will still see, the superiority, the uniqueness of these authors lie in the ability to present tradition in a creative and imaginative way. So that is probably what I can respond to what Arlo raised. And now I'm moving to Ariel. Yeah, I want to try to make sense of this contradiction, to the point that it will no longer be a contradiction, but it's a convergence of two different visions of Indonesia and of Indonesian literature. Some of the authors, yes, they write both about tradition and about cosmopolitan issues, but many you can really safely group them, who are not into cosmopolitanism and who are really into local colors or vernacularism. Okay. Yeah, so it's the same. There are writers who are interested in writing about secular issues, but then there is also very clearly there are writers who write about literature from the Islamic perspective. Okay? And that's why we have sastra Islam or sastra pesantren now. Yeah, sastra perempuan pesantren. sub genre. Okay. So rather than to see it as a contradiction, okay, then I would propose that we have converging trends happening at more or less the same time. Yeah. And so, but then the question is then how does locality figure into universalism? Because it seems that cosmopolitanism is associated more with universalism. But if you look at those cosmopolitan writers, let's say I will mention two. 𝗍𝗯𝗏 Basuki. 𝗍𝗯𝗏 Basuki writes a lot books about her experience of living in Singapore, marrying a Nepalese husband. Yeah, and although the setting is Singapore, yeah, the issues that she writes all the time, very consistently, is home, is Indonesia. Okay? So this is another contradiction. You are outside Indonesia, yeah, but you keep on writing about Indonesia. And then there is Leila Kudori, more recent novel, Pulang. Yeah? Pulang is set in Paris, in France. But then just from the title, you can see it's homebound. It's about going back to Indonesia, bringing the world home, bringing the world to Indonesia rather than bringing Indonesia out into the world. Yeah. So that is a way to explain it. If it's true that what is happening is that the world is brought home, okay, yeah, so contextualize the global into the local, then we can more easily figure out in what sense locality then does not contradict that, but actually goes hand in hand with that. Okay? Yeah. So home is being redefined from the outside and from the inside. That is what I would like to offer to you, how I would understand that contradiction. It's a diversity in relation to ethnic background, religious background, age, group, rural. One thing that I cannot really answer even to myself is that why are there so many more literary works produced? Why are there so many new writers when the publishing industry is becoming shrinking? Meaning only Gramedia is now holding the monopoly of literary production. What about all those small publishing in Jogja, in Bandung? They're operating with the help of technology. Now we don't have to open a bookstore. I don't have to submit the books that I publish to bookstores such as Gramedia, which demanded a lot of percentage and commission for them in comparison. So what they do now, they make use of online shopping platform. Okay, so they don't send their books to bookstore. They publish their books in their houses, and then you order using online platform. In 2 days, you will receive the book. And if you don't like it, you can return the book for refund. Yeah. So we see Gramedia now becomes the only one, perhaps. Even Periplus are closing down in many locations. But underneath, it's kind of an underground operation, is that these small local publishing enterprises, they sell their books through online shopping platform. And that's what keeps them alive. And that's what keeps writers be able to find publishers. And that is also why there are readers who don't go to Gramedia, yet they continue reading new literary works published in different places outside Jakarta or outside Java. Okay. So that is about circulation. Is there any subsidy or support from the state? Yes. The last 5 years, we've seen Badan Bahasa, that's an institution under the Ministry of Education and Culture, that is responsible to safeguard the language, the Indonesian language. They provide grants, they provide subsidies, and through sayembara or contest, through writer in residence program. Yeah. And they also work together with other ASEAN countries. Unfortunately, so far, still with Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, and to a certain extent, Thailand. Why? This is one problem which I hate, because it is based on Malay and Bahasa Indonesia literature. And that's why, Thailand, Northern Thailand, and other ASEAN countries in the continent, or even the Philippines, I don't know whether you are invited or not in this Masyarakat Sastra Asia Tenggara, or MASTRA, which meet every year with various programs, writer in residence, writing laboratory, workshop, and so on, exchange of writers. But I've never seen, Philippines or Laos or Cambodia or Burma involved or engaged in this. Only this Malay-speaking or Bahasa Indonesia-speaking ASEAN countries that are involved. And as far as I know, which is quite surprising, but it's a pleasant surprise, Badan Bahasa does not really apply censorship. Even if the work talks about 65 or other kind of past atrocities that happened in this country, but they allow people like me, okay, who are not bureaucrats, who are not part of the state, to help them select. And so in that sense, they will then trust your selection and will do whatever you recommend to them. Okay. So Melanie Budianta, Farouk from Gajah Mada University, people from Pajajaran University in Bandung or from UI, we are now actively involved in adjudicating, in selecting, and recommending. Okay. And that way, censorship, like what happened in the past, whenever state institution try to sponsor activities, can be prevented or avoided. So where does this rise of Indonesian literature go? Can that be a kind of soft power, even if it's at least in just the Southeast Asian region? No, unless that narrow scope of Malay language or Indonesian language is done away with. Okay. So can we introduce, writing together without having to resort to, any particular language in the Southeast Asian region as the primary language of this regional collaboration in literature. Okay. Yeah. So unless the existing project, the existing programs are really promising, but the only constraint that doesn't help it to move forward is because it is based on Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Melayu. That's why only 4 countries can be involved. Yeah. I'm not aware of any other program that survived for the long term, which is not designed based on Malay or Bahasa Indonesia by the state institution, Majelis Dewan Bahasa in Brunei, Majelis Bahasa in Malaysia, Badan Bahasa in Indonesia. Okay. And so it fails even to be a soft power in our own region. This literature. How can we make it orderless like K-pop? K-pop can be easily accepted everywhere because people can easily associate with them. But how can 10 Asian nations have to be at home with Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Malaysia, despite the fact that these are the 2 major languages in the Southeast Asia? But that's not the way we understand diversity, right? It's because you're major, then everybody has to go along with you. Okay. Is there any problem with writers writing about the dark past history of Indonesia? Not as I am aware of. Okay, yeah. So in certain places, in Yogyakarta and Solo particularly, yeah, we have seen a very disturbing rise of radicalism, but it is not a state-sanctioned radicalism. It's a kind of a fascism that grows up in society, in civil society, rather than something that is designed by the political society or by the state. The state, in fact, is trying hard to curb them, but the success is relative. Okay, yeah, with radicalism, and so any writing or discussion or forum deals with 65, then most of the time the reaction will come from radical Islamist groups or movements, and they're really strong in Central Java, in Yogyakarta and Solo, those 2 cities that we know are the most diverse and heterogeneous cities. So, but they're there. Now, how do I understand this? My understanding is that instead of perceiving it as the rise of Islamism or radicalism, how about we look at this phenomenon as a desperate final attempt to exist because they know that the state is no longer behind them. Okay. And now even the security forces, the police and so on, are forced to act more strongly and more firmly toward these groups. So in the past, they may have enjoyed the silent support of the security or state institutions. Nowadays, that is not the case. But because of that, then they try to show that they still exist in a desperate mode. So that is my understanding of, and so in connection to the new penal code, that is quite, controversial. I don't know, but this is my personal take. I'm basically happy with the new code. Why? Because I compare it with the old one. It's not because I compare it with the ideal that activists or idealists like me have of what it should be or what it should look like. But it's because I compare it with what existed before, the old penal code. For instance, that if you have an extramarital sex, then it is punishable by the new penal code. But that is not that easy. That is what is circulated in social media, okay? Especially Western press. But actually, that is something that people could easily do in the past. If I stayed in a hotel with somebody who is not my spouse, then everybody, can come, break the door, and arrest me. But today, the only person that can validly file a report in order for the police to be able to interfere into whatever you do in that hotel room is your spouse. So if my wife doesn't know and doesn't report it to the police, then they cannot take the initiative. In the past, they took the initiative without anybody reporting. So it's the same with premarital sex, for which my understanding is for underage kids. Why? Because the law connects the sanction for premarital sex with parents reporting. Can anybody else report? No. Only concerned parents can report. Without that report, nobody can do anything. In the past, even civilians who are not security forces or police officers can just break into your room and and punish you socially and morally. Now, why is the penal code still containing these issues? It's because that is the best negotiation they can do with the dynamic social, political, and cultural dynamic outside. You cannot have from 0 and then suddenly you have 100. But now we have 50. Is somewhere in between. It basically, rather than understanding it as a way to punish citizens, I would see it more as a way to prevent vigilantes, to prevent people who think they can take law in their own hand in order to do that. And so they make it almost impossible. It's wrong, yes. It is. Is it punishable by the law? Yes, but only if your spouse is the one who makes the report, or your parents, if you're an underage, who can make the report. With LGBTQ, it's the same. If it's underage, then parents. Now, if I'm a part of LGBTQ, no spouse will report. If I'm involved in an extramarital homosexual intercourse, for instance. Okay, So yeah, in practicality, then you are fine. But the lawmaker has to say something in order to calm down, the still conservative elements that are still there in society, as well as in the parliaments and among the bureaucratic structure. It's a process of negotiation that will continue. It doesn't stop here with this new law. So no, I don't see rising conservatism or any possibility that conservatism will be back and take over whatever freedom that we have enjoyed so far. Okay. So that is my understanding of the current penal code. Now and then the centrality of North America in the circulation in influencing what is happening with the development of literature in Indonesia. Not much, because we don't see enough Indonesian literature in the international world. Okay. So again, if I can complain, if I accept that North American centrality, then I will demand they do more in order to introduce our literature to the world. But the fact is that out beside Ayu Utami, Eka Kurniawan, and Pramudia Anantatur, who else Indonesian writers are well known in the international world? Almost none. Yeah. Again, it is more realistic and more concrete for Indonesian writers to think of how they can be read by 200 million Indonesian people from west to east. And that may be more complicated than gaining leadership in the international level. Why? Because the challenge now is coming from technology that encourages people to enjoy anything visually rather than read. Yeah. So you have lots of new writers, new literary books. Problem is, do people still read or not? Any kinds of book. It doesn't have to be literature. Or we are already 100% into visual process of perceiving and receiving information from the outside. So as a result, we now have fan fiction. Writers who really utilize technology in order to write, to distribute, to promote, and to gain leadership. Borderless. They use code mixing, code switching. Sometimes most of the words and expressions are in English, but they borrow characters that are already popular. So sometimes in one fan fiction, you can see Wonder Woman meet a Korean K-pop band actor, and then they are taking part in the story in an adventure together. And this fan fiction is really sophisticated. They have websites promoting fan fiction. Beautiful cover, beautiful ways of doing the marketing. They give even age rating. This is appropriate for 18 years old or and so on. And they also mention the collaborators. So it's not just the author, the cover designer, the whole team are all mentioned there. It's like promoting a movie. You have the director, you have the camera, lighting, and so on. Yeah? So that's when you open the website, then you will be able to see that the very professional. They imitate, they learn from other areas of artistic production. They mix. They don't create. They don't claim that these are originally their work, but they intentionally and explicitly make use characters from real life or from films, Hollywood movies, Korean movies, and so on, and then put them together in their work. So what is the impact? The impact is if you know if the personnel of BTS, and then you see that one or two of the personnel are in one of those books, then you are intrigued to find out what's happening with my favorite K-pop celebrities. Why is he in that book, for instance? Okay. Yeah. So very successful, even more successful than mainstream already known authors, more established authors who do not want to use digital platform to promote their books and still rely on Gramedia, for instance. Okay. I could give you later some of the links, and you will be impressed when you open and see. Yeah, and they're all young people who are fluent in using technology, in incorporating technology into their creative production. The fan fiction phenomena, which is huge now. Yeah. Also, going back to soft power, the way I see it, if you look at YouTube, you will be able to see artists, guitar player, singer, who are not into the commercialized industry, but they record their own activities and performance on their YouTube channels, and they gain millions and millions viewers and followers. People from different parts of the world now see, oh, Southeast Asia is crazy. Who will never thought that from that part of the world we can, have singers, artists who are as good as Celine Dion, who are better than the Scorpions or the Beatles and so on. Yeah, this is the soft power. This is a more concrete than literature. Okay. I think, and literary authors, they still have to figure out to find a way how to make use of technology, as far as possible. Transforming the practice, transforming the genre, transforming the mentality of the whole ecosystem. Then you will be able to see something which is different from now in any aspect, in terms of international recognition, in terms of regional collaboration. Everything will be made possible if you are willing to accept digital technology into the existing practice. So that is my point of view. Do I still have enough time, Roman? Or is that enough?
Well, if you have some more important comments to make, then we can probably have a few more minutes for the answers to our reactors.
Oh, there's one about orality. Okay, so in what way it's different from the old sense of orality that Walter Ong talked about? Okay. It's a kind of orality that is located in a very unique situation. Okay, so the situation is we are not done yet with literacy in Indonesia, and then we still have problems and statistics and complaints about how slow our literacy rate moves up. Yeah, how difficult it is to persuade students to read in class. And then we're not done with that yet. And then digital technology comes in. Yeah, and and in the middle of this struggle to make people read, suddenly people switch to a more attractive way of getting information, visual mode of accepting information. So you're not done with literacy yet, and then you have to jump into digital literacy. Yeah. Okay. And now, breaking away from Ong, the old orality that is supposed to fade away slowly, but is not completely gone because we are still struggling with literacy. Now that digital technology and digital literacy comes into play, orality gains unexpectedly a new space. So that is, I think, what I'm trying to say. Because people are now so occupied with any kinds of literacy. Yeah. And in literature, for instance, you have the 𝗩𝗲𝗃 community, for instance. There clearly is a movement to promote literacy. If you look at the works, kind of literary works promoted by the 𝗩𝗲𝗃 people, Gunawan Muhammad, Irwan Dewanto, Ayu Utami is part of that, Eka Kurniawan also to a certain extent. It's how to write in perfect Indonesian language. That is the characteristic of this 𝗩𝗲𝗃 community, and they see themselves as the promoter of the way of using the language in the right way. Okay. Yeah, so part of this tempo, circle, compass, yeah, and yeah. Whereas writers outside the 𝗩𝗲𝗃 community that are often thought to be inferior because they don't use the Indonesian language in the same sophisticated way as the 𝗩𝗲𝗃 writers do. And because they want to use more of elements of the local language and conversational language rather than formal language. So you see a lot of expressions in dialogues that do not really fit into the standard Indonesian language. Yeah. And if you ask Irwan Dewanto from 𝗩𝗲𝗃, oh, this is not a good piece of literary work. I don't know whether you agree or not with me, Arlo. Or yeah. Okay, so this is, and you see this circumstances created by the advent of digital technology actually helps writers who still hang on orality to survive rather than to die away. I should have been able to explain myself better, but I look at Bowman and also it seems that my time is up for this. So I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Manneke. So I think we have questions from Luna, Professor 𝗩𝗲𝗃𝗁. She was reacting a lot to many of the statements, and I think has a lot to say, a lot to react to your comments. Luna? Yeah, you're muted. Luna, yeah.
Hi. Manneke, since we agreed that I can refer to you as Manneke instead of Professor Budiman, I'd like to emphasize the stark contrast between the terrain of Indonesian literature that you are speaking of, in terms of, for us, at least I'm speaking as a writer writing in Filipino. There's this particular burden of using the nation in novel writing. And in recent years, we have begun to venture away from that template or that cage where other avenues are explored. Ramon Guillermo, who's part of our audience, has written Makina ni Mang Turing, which theorizes some other avenue. He uses the traditional game of sungka to talk about other things other than the burden of that nation concept. May I know if there are invisible narratives that are yet to be told because from our context, we are abundant with tales of woe about poverty, about displacement, about workers dying, for example, or domestic workers being abused, or Filipino women being raped. So there's all this talk about oppression and the decay of the moral firmament. In the new writing that you are talking about, the shift into the digital and to other avenues, are those topics still talked about? In other words, do we have something in common in terms of tackling that moral firmament decay? And I was asking this because I stumbled upon a poem written by 𝗍𝗪, and it's ashamed to be Indonesian. And there's this long part where he itemizes some of the commonalities a Filipino citizen would really agree with. For example, in my land, corruption in bureaucracy has a world-class rating, #1. Those kinds of statements.
Yeah.
So we can absolutely relate to that. But we want to know if there's an upper kind of discourse towards this kind of addressing the issue. Thank you,
Can I add something to Luna's question? Because in the Philippines, another point of contrast, and now the term national literature is such an important, debated and disputed idea. So in Indonesia, for example, is there still a place for that notion, sastra nasional or national literature? And if that's the case, what could it possibly mean in Indonesia, given the developments that you have been talking about?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Luna and Bowman. So let me start with Luna. All of the issues that you mentioned appearing in the literature of the Philippines, they're all here as well in Indonesia. Name any social issue, then you will be able to find writers who write about them. You will be able to find works. One thing that, because of your question, then it makes me think really hard. One thing that is invisible from all these works, that writers don't really write about or never touch that even to the present day, is the future. What does the future say for us? Okay, from the perspective of the present. Writing about the past, that's a lot. Okay? Rewriting history, but I don't really find any vision about the future of Indonesianness, the future of Indonesia. That is something that I don't see yet, and I don't know why. Nobody writes about that or speculates about that imaginatively through literature. And probably that's something that I need to explore after this. Yeah. So the future seems to be something that is dreadful, or it's totally dark. Yeah. So that you cannot say anything about it. It's either you are trapped in the present with all those contemporary issues, or you try to go back to the past and try to understand the past in a different way. But yeah, what is missing is the future. I think a topic that is not in anybody's work. And if you try to relate that to a particular genre like science fiction, for instance, we don't have science fiction. Okay, that is also one. The more you think about it, it's the more intriguing. Why don't we produce science fiction? Vision about the future. what the future will be in our imagination. So, but the rest, the abuse of Indonesian migrant workers, domestic rape, corruption, they are all there. Yeah, it's everybody has their own interests that are liners among Christians in Indonesia who always, also respond very strongly to different moral and social issues. You have those from Hindu denomination doing the same thing. Yeah, so it's not the monopoly of the Islamists anymore nowadays. I'm trying to connect this with what. Bowman, can you please briefly repeat the key point?
Yeah. So in the Philippines, the problem of national literature is something like a problem that doesn't go away. So,
we don't talk about it anymore, Bowman. It's very surprising. After the reformasi, you no longer hear identitas nasional, kepribadian nasional. Bahasa nasional is still there every now and then. Every time we commemorate the 28th of October, the Youth Oath, then the discussion and issue about national language. But if you read people's thought put in those writing about national language, you will see a very progressive and revolutionary outlook. It's not about keeping and preserving the national language in order to keep it alive, but how to help the national language be part and be adaptive to the international dynamics. So that is the tone now. So we don't talk about the national in the same way as before. And for many literary writers, it's no longer relevant to talk about. Okay? National themes are no longer relevant. If you don't agree, you have to tell me. Okay? Yeah, but that's my position, and that's what my observation. Nobody writes about anything national anymore now.
Ariel has a question, I think, or a follow-up.
Yes, on the issue of Sastra Nacional. I mean, of course, in the Philippines, we have national artists for literature. In Indonesia, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's a Sastrawan Nacional, no? There's nothing like that. But of course, you have many Pahlawan Nacional, right? But do you think it would be helpful, to have that distinction, national, bestowed by the state? To have a Sastrawan Nacional or something to that effect, like in the Philippines we have.
It's a totally different meaning of Sastrawan Nasional if you compare it with Malaysia, for instance, or Brunei. Sastrawan Nasional there is actually poet laureate, whose life is supported by the state and receiving subsidy and all kinds of facilities from the state. Sastrawan Nasional in Indonesia, they only receive a piece of certificate and probably a certain amount of money, and that's it. Yeah, so it's more like a tokenism rather than something that you believe truly are important. So, and it's only quite recently, I think it's only this year that we have this new kind of award called Sastrawan Nasional. But again, if you look at it, it doesn't mean anything. It's actually, basically, it's an award that is given to an author who has proven commitment for the development and advancement of Indonesian literature. So that means no young authors will be able to be Sastrawan Nasional, because you need to have a certain track record as proof that you deserve this achievement. It's more like a long life achievement award, for instance. A recognition of that. Yeah. So it doesn't have the same weight, perhaps, as in Malaysia, Brunei, or even perhaps with the Philippines.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big difference. I think we are having, how many minutes do we have left? Around, I think, a few more minutes. I think our reactors might have other follow-up questions for you. We have 2 minutes left. Sorry, we have 2 minutes left. So, okay, so maybe Pat Manneke can give his final words, and then we can go to the synthesis.
Yeah, we don't exactly know where Indonesian literature is heading to, but we have the reason to be encouraged and to be optimistic with the diversity, with this genuine concerns that authors now have about a whole range of social issues. In the past, we don't really see that, but now it seems to be in everybody's concern if you are within the literary circle in this country. And for that reason, we can expect some good things to come up in the future.
Okay. Yes, I would like to thank our main speaker, Professor Budiman. I would like to thank also our reactors with their wonderful reactions, Dom, Arlo, and and Ariel Lopez, and then Luna's comments also, and all our listeners, everyone interested in contemporary Indonesian literature. And I don't think I can really summarize the whole thing that we talked about because it was really so vast and so various. But I think we are starting some kind of important conversation. And I think the questions that were raised by our actors, we have to follow them up and we have to deepen the answers to them by deepening our knowledge of Indonesian society, literature, and culture. So I think this is a good step to make. I think this is a great step for us in the Institute of Creative Writing in UP Diliman that we are holding these kinds of fora. And I would hope that Pak Budiman in the Universitas Indonesia would also undertake similar conversations with us on the other side of the ocean border to Indonesia. So I think continue our conversations, and I would like to thank everyone. It was a very, very lovely conversation this afternoon. Thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak.